The first thing you learn about an Oerlikon is that it never stops shaking. Even when you're not firing, the vibration runs through the mount, up through your hands, and settles somewhere deep in your chest. By October 1944, after months in the Pacific, that tremor had become part of me, like a second heartbeat that reminded me I was still alive. I was crouched behind my 20mm gun on the destroyer USS Johnston, watching the dawn break over Leyte Gulf on October 25th. The water stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with more American ships than I'd ever seen in one place. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, escorts, Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, and Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet combined into the most powerful naval force the world had ever assembled. But something was wrong with this morning. The usual chatter over the radio had turned sharp and urgent. Reports were flooding in from all directions. Japanese naval forces approaching from multiple vectors, bigger than anything we'd faced since Midway. Operation Shogo, they called it. Japan's desperate last gamble to destroy our invasion of the Philippines. I adjusted my grip on the Oerlikon's handles and checked my ammunition belts for the 100th time. Each belt held 60 rounds of 20mm high explosive shells, designed to tear aircraft apart. Around me, the other gunners were doing the same, checking, adjusting, waiting. The Bofors 40mm crews were cycling their 4-barrel mounts, and somewhere below, the 5-inch gun crews were loading fused shells that could detonate in proximity to incoming aircraft. All hands, this is the captain, came the voice over the ship's intercom. Intelligence reports indicate multiple Japanese naval forces converging on our position. We are part of Task Unit 77.4. 3, Taffy 3, and our job is to protect the escort carriers supporting our ground forces on Leyte. This is not a drill. I looked out across the water at our little flotilla. 6 escort carriers, baby flat tops we called them, and 7 destroyers and destroyer escorts. We were the expendable screen, positioned between the valuable fleet carriers and the invasion beaches. If something came at us from the north, we'd be the first to know about it. The past 3 days had been a nightmare of scattered reports and half-understood battles. On October 23rd, our submarines had ambushed a Japanese force in Palawan Passage, sinking cruisers and sending the rest scattering. Yesterday, our carrier planes had pounded another Japanese fleet in the Sibuyan Sea, sending the massive battleship Musashi to the bottom after taking countless torpedo and bomb hits. But Admiral Halsey had taken the main carrier force north, chasing what intelligence said was the remainder of the Japanese carrier fleet. That left us, Taffy 3, as the northernmost covering force for the late invasion. Just 18 small ships against whatever might come over the horizon. I didn't have to wait long to find out what that would be. At 6:45 a.m., the lookouts started shouting. Masts on the horizon to the north, too many masts, too big to be friendly. Within minutes, the recognition was confirmed and blood in my veins turned to ice water. Battleships. Japanese battleships with cruisers and destroyers in formation behind them. Center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the same fleet that was supposed to have been turned back yesterday after losing the Musashi. But here they were, 34 warships strong, led by the Yamato herself. The Yamato, 72,000 tons of steel and fury, mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing as much as a small car over 20 miles. Behind her came 3 more battleships, including the Nagato and Congo, plus heavy cruisers whose 8-inch guns could reach us long before our 5-inch batteries could even threaten them. General Quarters. General Quarters. All hands man your battle stations. The alarm bells clanged across the ship as men ran to their positions. I was already at mine, but I checked my ammunition again anyway. 60 rounds in the current belt, 4 more belts stacked and ready. 300 rounds total against the greatest naval armada Japan had ever sent to sea. Captain Ernest Evans, our skipper, didn't hesitate. While the escort carriers frantically launched what aircraft they could and began making smoke, the Johnston and our fellow destroyers turned north and increased speed. We were charging directly at a force that outgunned us by more than 10 to 1. "What the hell are we doing?" shouted Ramirez, the gunner on the Bofors mountain next to me. "Our job," I called back, though my mouth was so dry I could barely get the words out. The Japanese opened fire first. Those massive guns, easily visible even at extreme range, erupted in orange flame and smoke. Seconds later, the shells came down like freight trains falling from the sky. Towering geysers of water erupted around us as 14-inch and 16-inch projectiles bracketed our formation. Each explosion sent tons of seawater cascading down on the deck, and the concussion waves felt like being punched in the chest by an invisible giant. Captain Evans brought us in at flank speed, weaving between the shell splashes while our own 5-inch guns returned fire. At first, our shots fell short. The range was just too great. But as we closed the distance, our gunners found their mark. I watched through binoculars as our shells burst against the superstructure of a Japanese heavy cruiser, sending showers of sparks into the morning air. Then the cruiser's 8-inch guns turned toward us. The first salvo screamed overhead with a sound like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. The second salvo was closer, close enough that the blast knocked me sideways against my gun mount. The third salvo found us. The explosion lifted the Johnston's stern clean out of the water and threw me against the ammunition storage locker. When I pulled myself upright, my ears were ringing and smoke was pouring from somewhere aft. But my Oerlikon was still intact, still loaded, still ready. Damage report. Someone was shouting over the intercom, but I couldn't make out the response over the ringing in my ears. What I could see was more important anyway. Aircraft silhouettes on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Japanese aircraft. Dozens of them, coming in low and fast from the north. Some were conventional attackers, D-4Y duty dive bombers and B-6 Angel torpedo planes. But mixed in with them, I could see the others. The ones with the telltale modifications and the single pilot. Kamikazes. This was it. Everything we'd trained for, everything we'd feared, all compressed into the next few minutes. The Japanese Navy was throwing everything they had at us, battleships, cruisers, and now suicide planes loaded with bombs and fuel, piloted by men who had already said goodbye to their families. Aircraft inbound. The cry went up from every ship in the formation. All guns, commence firing. I swung my Oerlikon toward the incoming formation and squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked against my shoulder as 20mm shells streamed out at 600 rounds per minute. Around me, every anti-aircraft weapon in Taffy 3 opened up simultaneously. 40mm Bofors guns hammered out their deeper rhythm, while the 5-inch batteries fired time-fused shells that burst in black puffs among the incoming aircraft. The sky filled with tracers and explosions. It was like watching deadly fireworks in broad daylight, streams of red and orange tracers crisscrossing the air, black smoke bursts from the larger guns, and the constant muzzle flashes from hundreds of weapons firing at once. The first wave of conventional attackers came in high, their bombs glinting in the morning sun. I tracked the Judy as it rolled into its dive, leading it just like they'd taught us in gunnery school. My shells walked up toward the aircraft, and I saw hits sparking along its wing. But it kept coming, committed to its attack run on the carrier Gambier Bay. The bomb hit just after the carrier's island, sending a pillar of flame and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Even from 2,000 yards away, I could feel the heat wash over us. But the Gambier Bay stayed afloat, her damage control teams already fighting the fires. Then I saw them, the kamikazes. They came in lower than the conventional attackers, their engines screaming at full throttle. These pilots weren't planning to pull out of their dives. They were aiming to take their aircraft, their bombs, and themselves directly into our ships. Death was their mission, destruction their only goal. The first kamikaze targeted the escort carrier Saint Lo. I swung my gun around and opened fire, watching my tracers reach out toward the diving aircraft. Other gunners were shooting at the same target, the air around the diving plane filled with explosive shells and machine gun bullets. Hits sparked all along the kamikaze's fuselage. Pieces of wing and engine cowling flew off in the slipstream. Smoke poured from the aircraft's engine. But still it came on, the pilot somehow keeping control despite the devastating damage. The plane hit the Saint Lo's flight deck in a ball of orange flame. For a moment, I thought that was the end of it, just another crashed aircraft to be pushed overboard. Then the secondary explosion started. The kamikaze's bomb had penetrated deep into the carrier before detonating, setting off stored aviation fuel and ammunition. The Saint Lo erupted like a volcano, her back broken by the internal explosions. In less than 30 minutes, she was gone, sunk by a single aircraft flown by a single determined pilot. But there were more coming. Incoming port quarter, someone screamed. I spun my gun around to see another kamikaze diving toward our escort carrier group. This one was trailing smoke from the engine, already damaged by a fighter cover, but still committed to his attack. Every gun in the task unit that could bear on the target opened fire. The Bofors mount sent up a curtain of 40mm shells, while we Oerlikon gunners added our streams of 20mm fire. The 5-inch guns fired proximity-fused shells. They'd exploded in black bursts all around the diving aircraft. I could see the pilot in the cockpit, his face grim with concentration as he fought to keep his damaged aircraft on target. Pieces were flying off his plane continuously now, bits of wing fabric, chunks of engine housing, fragments of the propeller. But he held his dive, aiming for the carrier Kinkaid Bay. My hands were cramping from gripping the gun so tightly, but I kept firing. The Oerlikon bucked and chattered, empty shell casings cascading down around my feet. The barrel was heating up from the continuous fire, shimmering in the morning air. 50 yards from the Kinkaid Bay, the kamikaze finally came apart. Whether it was our gunfire or structural failure from the damage, the aircraft disintegrated in midair. The engine block tumbled into the sea while burning fuel and debris rained down on the carrier's deck. Close, too close, but not a hit. The reprieve lasted exactly 37 seconds. Multiple contacts. Bearings are 30. The radar operator's voice cracked with strain. At least 6 aircraft inbound, low and fast. I reloaded as quickly as my shaking hands would allow, snapping a fresh 60-round belt into place. Around me, the other gunners were doing the same, their faces blackened with corded smoke and streaked with sweat, despite the cool morning air. This time, they came in coordinated. 6 kamikazes in loose formation, approaching from different angles to split our defensive fire. They'd learned from watching their comrades die. These pilots were better, more experienced, more dangerous. The lead aircraft targeted the Johnston herself. I could see the red rising sun painted on the wings as it dove toward us, the pilot's white headband visible in the cockpit. This was no frightened boy sent to die for the Emperor. This was a veteran naval aviator who had chosen to end his life as a human bomb. Every gun on our destroyer opened fire. The 40mm Bofors mounts trained around to meet the threat, while the 5-inch guns depressed to minimum elevation, firing point-blank into the diving aircraft. I held my trigger down and walked my stream of tracers into the kamikaze's path, leading the target, adjusting for wind and the relative motion of both aircraft and ship. The kamikaze flew directly through our concentrated fire. I saw my shells hitting, saw pieces of aluminum skin peeling away from the wings, saw smoke beginning to pour from the engine. But the aircraft kept coming, kept diving, the pilot somehow maintaining control as his machine disintegrated around him. 20 yards from impact, the kamikaze's left wing folded upward from battle damage. The aircraft cartwheeled sideways, missing our bridge by mere feet, and crashed into the sea off our starboard bow. The explosion sent a geyser of water and burning gasoline high into the air, drenching half our crew with seawater that reeked of aviation fuel. But the other 5 were still coming. I swung my gun toward the nearest target, a Zero diving on the Escort carrier White Plains. This pilot was good, jinking his aircraft slightly from side to side to throw off our aim while maintaining his general course toward the carrier. Smart, experienced, deadly. The air around the diving kamikaze filled with tracer fire from a dozen ships. Red streams of machine gun bullets, orange streams from the 20mm guns, white puffs from the 40mm Bofors, and black bursts from the 5-inch proximity shells. It looked like a deadly spider web with the kamikaze at the center, flying through fire that should have destroyed any aircraft instantly. But he kept coming. I could see the bomb slung beneath his fuselage now, a 250-kilogram weapon that would gut any ship it hit. The pilot had his canopy open, whether from battle damage or by choice, I couldn't tell. His face was set in absolute determination, focused entirely on his target. The White Plains was turning hard to port, her captain trying to present the smallest possible target profile. Black smoke poured from her stack as the engineers pushed her elderly engines beyond their design limits. But escort carriers weren't built for speed. She could barely make 18 knots in ideal conditions. 50 yards from the carrier, the kamikaze flew into a 40mm shell that took off his starboard wing. The aircraft went into an uncontrolled spin, tumbling through the air like a broken toy. But momentum and gravity still carried it toward the white plains, and for a heart-stopping moment, it looked like the wreckage might still hit the carrier's flight deck. Instead, the remains off aircraft and pilot splashed into the sea just off the carrier's stern, so close that burning gasoline splashed up onto her fantail. The carrier's damage control teams were already running toward the flames with foam and water hoses. 4 kamikazes left. The next one was already in his final dive, aimed at the carrier Fanshawe Bay. This pilot was taking no chances. He came straight down from high altitude, building up tremendous speed and making himself a difficult target. But the steeper angle also made him predictable. Every gun that could train on the target opened fire. I added my stream of 20mm shells to the barrage, though at this range and angle, hitting a fast-moving target was more luck than skill. The key was volume of fire, putting so many projectiles in the air that the kamikaze couldn't avoid them all. The concentrated firepower did its job. The diving aircraft flew into what looked like a solid wall of exploding metal. I saw hits all along the fuselage and wings, saw the canopy disintegrate in a shower of plexiglass, saw the engine begin trailing black smoke. But the pilot held his dive, even as his aircraft came apart around him. Even as flames began licking back from the engine, he kept the nose pointed directly at the Fanshawe Bay's flight deck. At last second, the aircraft's controls must have failed. The nose dropped suddenly, and instead of hitting the carrier amidships, the kamikaze plowed into the water just short of the hull. The explosion was tremendous, a pillar of flame and water that rose higher than the carrier's mast, but the ship herself was untouched. 3 left, and they were learning from each attack. The next pair came in together, timing their dives to hit simultaneously from different angles. Classic tactics forced the defenders to split their fire and reduce the effective concentration on each target. One dove on the carrier Kinkaid from the port quarter while his wingman attacked the Saint Lo from starboard. I had to choose which target to engage, knowing that whichever one I didn't shoot had a better chance of getting through. I chose the one diving on the Saint Lo, partly because it was a clearer shot and partly because something about that pilot's approach looked more dangerous. He was coming in shallow and fast, building up speed in a long glide that would be hard to intercept. My Oerlikon chattered and bucked as I poured fire into the kamikaze's path. Other gunners were shooting at the same target, and I could see our shells hitting. But this pilot was either very skilled or very lucky. He kept his aircraft flying through damage that should have brought him down. Meanwhile, the second kamikaze was pressing his attack on the Kinkaid. That carrier's gunners were putting up a fierce barrage, their tracers creating orange streaks across the morning sky. But the diving aircraft kept coming, smoke trailing from multiple hits, but still under control. The first kamikaze reached the Saint Lo at almost the same moment his wingman reached the Kinkaid. Both pilots, wounded and flying dying aircraft, pushed their attacks home with fanatical determination. The Kinkaid's gunners got their kamikaze at the last possible second. A 40mm shell took off the aircraft's tail, sending it into an uncontrolled tumble that carried it past the carrier and into the sea. The explosion was close enough to shower the ship's deck with burning gasoline, but the hull remained intact. The Saint Lo wasn't so lucky. The kamikaze hit her flight deck near the after elevator, his bomb penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, just a relatively small hole in the wooden deck and some scattered fires. Then the secondary explosions began. Aviation gasoline, stored ammunition, torpedo warheads. Everything that makes an aircraft carrier deadly also makes it incredibly vulnerable when those weapons turn against the ship itself. The Saint Lo erupted in a series of explosions that lifted her entire stern section out of the water. I watched in horror as men began jumping from the burning carrier's deck. Some were on fire themselves, human torches disappearing into the dark water. Others were trying to launch life rafts or throw anything that would float over the side. The ship's magazines were cooking off now, sending shells and rockets in random directions as the fires reached them. Within 30 minutes, the Saint Lo was gone. One kamikaze, one pilot, one aircraft, and they'd erased 800 officers and men along with an entire escort carrier. But there was no time to grieve. The last kamikaze was beginning his attack run. This one was different. Instead of the steep dive attacks we'd been seeing, this pilot came in low and fast across the water, using the wave tops to mask his approach until the last moment. By the time our lookout spotted him, he was already too close for the 5-inch guns to depress low enough to engage. It was up to the close-range weapons now, the 40mm Bofors and the 20mm Oerlikons. The pilot had chosen his approach well, coming in from an angle that limited how many guns could bear on his target. But he'd made one mistake. He was heading directly for the Johnston. I spun my gun mount around to meet the threat, the Oerlikon's electric motors whining as they brought the weapon to bear. The kamikaze was less than a mile out now, racing across the wave tops at what had to be over 300 miles per hour. At that speed and distance, I had maybe 20 seconds before he reached us. The aircraft was a Zero, an A6M that had seen better days. The paint was faded and chipped, and I could see battle damage along the wings and fuselage from previous encounters. But the engine was running smoothly, and the pilot's approach was steady and professional. I opened fire at 800 yards, my tracers reaching out toward the racing fighter. Other guns joined in, the 40mm mounts, a couple of 50 caliber machine guns from the bridge wings. Everything we had that could track a fast-moving target at low altitude. The kamikaze flew through our fire without deviating from his course. I could see my shells hitting, bright flashes along the wings and engine cowling, but the aircraft kept coming. Pieces of the Zero were flying off in the slipstream, but not enough pieces, not the right pieces. At 400 yards, I could see the pilot clearly. He was young, maybe 20 years old, with a white headband tied around his leather flying helmet. His face was set in absolute concentration as he held his aircraft steady despite the damage it was taking. In a different war, under different circumstances, I might have admired his courage. But this was October 25, 1944, and he was trying to kill me and my shipmates. I walked my fire across the Zero's nose, aiming for the engine. At this range, the 20mm high explosive shells were devastating. I saw the cowling disintegrate, saw smoke begin pouring from the cylinders, saw the propeller begin to wobble as the engine came apart. But momentum kept the aircraft coming. Even with his engine failing, even with half his aircraft shot away, the pilot held his course. 200 yards and closing fast. The 40mm guns got him first. A Bofors shell took off the Zero's port wing just outboard of the landing gear, sending the aircraft into a violent roll to the left. But the pilot somehow managed to level out, flying his crippled machine on one wing in determination alone. 100 yards. I could see the bomb now, a dark shape slung beneath the Zero's belly. The pilot was fighting his controls, trying to keep the nose pointed at our ship as his aircraft began to break apart around him. I held down the trigger, pouring every remaining shell in my belt into the dying aircraft. Empty brass casings rained down around my feet as the Oerlikon hammered out its deadly rhythm. Hit after hit sparkled along the Zero's fuselage, but still it came on. 50 yards. The pilot was slumped forward in his cockpit now, probably wounded or dead, but his hands were still on the controls, still guiding his aircraft toward our ship. Blood was streaking back from the open canopy, whipped away by the slipstream. 25 yards. Close enough to see the individual rivets on the Zero's aluminum skin, close enough to read the serial numbers painted on the wing. The aircraft was more holes than metal now, held together by nothing but velocity and the dying pilot's will. At 15 yards, physics finally won. The Zero's remaining wing folded upward from the accumulated damage, and the aircraft cartwheeled sideways past our starboard beam. The pilot, still strapped into his cockpit, disappeared beneath the waves along with his bomb and his dreams of glorious death. The explosion, when it came, was muffled by the water. A geyser of spray and flame erupted just off our starboard side, close enough to soak everyone on deck, but not close enough to cause damage. In the spreading oil slick, I could see pieces of wing and fuselage floating alongside a white headband that had somehow survived the crash. The immediate air attack was over, but the surface battle was just reaching its climax. While we'd been fighting off the kamikaze, Captain Evans had brought the Johnston close enough to launch our torpedoes at the Japanese battle line. All 10 of our fish were running true, their white wakes pointing like arrows toward the massive enemy ships. I watched through binoculars as our torpedoes reached their targets. Most missed. Hitting a maneuvering warship at long range with World War II-era torpedoes was more art than science. But at least 2 found their mark, erupting against the hull of a Japanese heavy cruiser in towering columns of water and smoke. The cruiser, I later learned it was a Suzuya, began listing to port, her speed dropping as she fell out of formation. Our destroyer's torpedoes had wounded a ship that could have sunk us with a single salvo, and the satisfaction was fierce and immediate. But the Japanese weren't finished with us. The Yamato and her consorts had been closing the range steadily, and now their massive guns were finding our formation with increasing accuracy. Shell splashes walked closer and closer to our ships, each explosion sending tons of seawater skyward. Then they found us. The first hit took out our after gun mount, the 5-inch turret disappearing in a ball of orange flame. The concussion knocked me flat against the deck, my helmet ringing like a bell from the impact. When I pulled myself upright, the entire stern of the ship was wreathed in smoke and fire. But my Oerlikon was still functional, and there were more aircraft inbound. This time it was a mixed formation, conventional torpedo bombers escorted by fighters, with at least 3 more kamikazes mixed into the group. The Japanese were learning, using the conventional attackers to draw our fire while the suicide planes slipped through our defenses. The torpedo bombers came in low and parallel to the water, their fish already visible beneath their fuselages. These were B-6 Jills, newer and faster than the older Kates we'd faced earlier in the war. Their pilots were good too, maintaining formation to spittier anti-aircraft fire, setting up for coordinated attacks on our escort carriers. I chose my target and opened fire. This Jill was heading for the Fanshawe Bay, already damaged from the earlier attacks. The torpedo bomber's pilot saw my tracers and tried to jink his aircraft to avoid them, but at low altitude and heavy with ordnance, the Jill couldn't maneuver effectively. My shells walked along the aircraft's port wing, then across the fuselage behind the cockpit. I saw the gunner in the rear seat slump forward over his machine gun, hit by fragments from my exploding shells. But the pilot kept flying, kept his aircraft on course toward the carrier. The Jill was maybe 300 yards from torpedo release when a 40mm shell from the Fanshawe Bay's own guns took off its port wing. The aircraft rolled inverted and hit the water nose first, its torpedo exploding on impact in a massive underwater detonation that sent a waterspout higher than our mast. But while we'd been dealing with the torpedo bombers, the kamikazes had been closing in. The first one came at us from dead ahead, flying so low that his propeller was kicking up spray from the wave tops. This pilot knew what he was doing, approaching from the angle that presented the smallest target while making it difficult for our guns to depress low enough to engage effectively. I cranked my gun mount down to minimum elevation and opened fire anyway. At this range, even a near miss might be enough to damage the kamikaze's control surfaces or wound the pilot. My shells sent up fountains of spray just ahead of the racing aircraft, but the pilot never deviated from his course. The 40mm guns were having better luck. Their shells could reach down to wave top level, and I watched their tracers converging on the approaching Zero. Hit after hit sparkled along the aircraft's fuselage, but still it kept coming. At 200 yards, the kamikaze pulled up into a shallow climb, aiming for our bridge. The pilot was visible in the cockpit, hunched forward over his controls, probably wounded but still flying. His aircraft was trailing smoke and losing pieces, but the engine was still running and the bomb was still attached. Every gun on the Johnston that could bear on the target was firing now. The air was so thick with tracers and explosions that it seemed impossible for anything to fly through it and survive. But the Zero kept climbing, kept closing, the pilot's determination overcoming both battle damage and the law of averages. At 50 yards, I could see the pilot's face clearly. He was young, maybe 19 or 20, with blood running down from a scalp wound. But his eyes were focused entirely on our bridge, calculating the final approach for his sacrifice. That's when gunner's mate Peterson, manning the starboard 40mm mount, got him. The Bofors shell hit the Zero's engine dead center, and the aircraft simply disappeared in a ball of flame and smoke. 1 second, there was a diving kamikaze 50 yards away. The next second, there was nothing but burning debris raining down into the sea. But even as that threat ended, another was beginning. The last 2 kamikazes had held back, watching their comrades attack, learning from their failures. Now they came at us together, one high and one low, coordinating their attacks to maximize their chances of success. The high one was diving on the carrier Gambier Bay, while the low one skimmed the waves toward the White Plains. Both pilots were flying damaged aircraft. Smoke trails and missing pieces marked their earlier encounters with our defensive fire, but both were still in control and still committed to their final missions. I had to choose again, high or low, carrier or carrier. In the end, I chose the low one because he was closer and because something about his approach looked more immediately dangerous. This kamikaze was flying a damaged Zero with its port aileron shot away, forcing the pilot to constantly fight the aircraft's tendency to roll left. But he was compensating well, keeping his machine on course despite the control difficulties. I opened fire at 600 yards, my tracers reaching out across the water toward the approaching fighter. The range was long for a 20mm gun, but I had plenty of ammunition and nothing but time until the kamikaze reached his target. My first burst fell short, sending up splashes just behind the Zero's tail. I adjusted my aim and fired again, this time seeing my shells impact along the aircraft's starboard wing. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away in the slipstream, but the wing stayed attached and the pilot maintained control. The kamikaze was 300 yards from the White Plains when the carrier's own gunners found their mark. A 5-inch proximity shell burst just off the Zero's port wing, and the shrapnel shredded what remained of the aircraft's control surfaces. The Zero began to roll uncontrollably to the left, the pilot fighting desperately to level out as his aircraft tumbled toward the sea. For a moment, it looked like he might manage it. The roll slowed, then stopped with the wings almost level. But it was too late. The Zero hit the water at nearly 300 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact in a shower of spray and burning fuel. The pilot's body, thrown clear by the impact, floated face down in the spreading oil slick. That left one kamikaze still diving on the Gambier Bay. This pilot had learned from watching all the others die. Instead of diving straight down or approaching at wave-top level, he came in at a moderate angle, fast enough to be difficult to hit but not so steep that he couldn't pull out if necessary. More importantly, he was good. Really good. As our tracers reached out toward his aircraft, he began a series of gentle weaving maneuvers that made it almost impossible to predict exactly where he'd be when our shells reached his altitude. The Gambier Bay's gunners were throwing everything they had at the diving Zero. Their 40mm Bofors guns were firing so fast that the barrels glowed red-hot in the morning air. The 20mm gunners were walking their fire back and forth across the kamikaze's projected path. Even the 50 caliber machine gunners were contributing, adding their streams of armor-piercing bullets to the defensive barrage. But the Zero kept coming, weaving through the fire like a deadly dancer. The pilot was wounded. I could see blood on the canopy, but his flying was still precise and controlled. He was perhaps 200 yards from the carrier when a lucky shot from one of our guns hit his aircraft's bomb. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The 250-kilogram bomb detonated while still attached to the Zero, vaporizing both aircraft and pilot in a flash of white light. The blast wave, even at 200 yards, was strong enough to knock men down on the Gambier Bay's deck. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a few pieces of twisted metal floating in the water. The kamikaze attack was over, but the surface battle was just reaching its peak. While we'd been fighting off the suicide planes, the Japanese battle line had closed to within 15,000 yards, point-blank range for their massive guns. The Yamato's 18.1-inch rifles spoke first, their muzzle flashes visible even in daylight. The shells, each one weighing over 3,000 pounds, screamed overhead with a sound like an approaching freight train. When they hit the water around our formation, the explosions sent geysers of spray 300 feet into the air. But Captain Evans wasn't backing down. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the damage we'd already taken, he kept the Johnston in the fight. Our remaining 5-inch guns continued firing at the Japanese cruisers, while we laid smoke to screen the retreat of the escort carriers. The next hour was a nightmare of shell splashes and near misses. The Japanese had us bracketed. Their shots were falling just short, then just over, working their way toward the correct range. It was only a matter of time before they found us. The hit that finally crippled us came from an 8-inch shell fired by the heavy cruiser Tone. The projectile punched through our forward magazine, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were going to blow up like the Saint Lo. But our damage control teams had flooded the magazine the moment we went to general quarters, and instead of exploding, the shell just started a massive fire. Still, the Johnston kept fighting. With half our guns out of action and our speed reduced to barely 10 knots, we continued to engage the Japanese battle line. Captain Evans brought us so close to the enemy that we were taking machine gun fire from their destroyers. It was during this final phase of the surface action that I saw something that changed my understanding of what we were actually accomplishing. Through my binoculars, I watched as the massive Japanese formation began to turn away. They were retreating. Despite their overwhelming advantage in firepower and numbers, despite having us outgunned 10-1, the Japanese were breaking off the attack. Later, I learned why. Admiral Kurita, commanding the center force, had been told to expect heavy resistance from fleet carriers and fast battleships. What he found instead was a handful of escort carriers and destroyers that fought with such fierce determination that he became convinced he was facing the main American fleet. Our desperate charge, our refusal to break off despite impossible odds, had convinced the Japanese admiral that he was walking into a trap. The ferocity of our defense, the accuracy of our torpedo attacks, the sheer audacity of destroyers engaging battleships, all of it suggested that Admiral Halsey's main force was nearby, ready to spring an ambush. So Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw, just as victory was within his grasp. The greatest naval force Japan had ever assembled turned away from a handful of American ships whose crews refused to give up. But the victory came at a terrible cost. As the Japanese battleships disappeared over the northern horizon, I could see the Johnston was dying beneath our feet. The fires were spreading faster than our damage control teams could contain them, and we were taking on water through several shell holes below the waterline. Captain Evans gave the order to abandon ship at 9:45 a.m. I took one last look at my Oerlikon, the weapon that had been my world for the past 3 hours, and followed the other survivors toward the life rafts. The Johnston rolled over and sank at 10:10 a.m., taking Captain Evans and 185 of our shipmates with her. As I floated in the oily water, watching our destroyer disappear beneath the waves, I realized we'd been part of something extraordinary. We'd faced the largest naval force Japan had ever sent to sea, over 60 warships including Yamato, and we'd turned them back. Not through superior firepower or numbers, but through sheer determination and the willingness to fight against impossible odds. The kamikazes had promised their families that death would bring glory and victory. Instead, they'd found only oily waves and the bottom of the Pacific. Their sacrifice had accomplished nothing except to demonstrate the futility of Japan's position. But our sacrifice, the men who died manning their guns to the last moment, the pilots who flew damaged aircraft into overwhelming enemy fire, the sailors who stayed at their damage control stations while their ships burned around them, our sacrifice had saved the invasion of the Philippines and broken the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy. As rescue ships pulled us from the water, I could see the rest of the battle still raging in the distance. Admiral Halsey's carriers, rushing back from their pursuit of the Japanese decoy force, were catching up with the retreating center force. Black smoke columns on the horizon marked where Japanese cruisers and destroyers were taking their final punishment from American bombs and torpedoes. Meanwhile, to the south, reports were flooding in of a complete American victory in Surigao Strait. Vice Admiral Nishimura's Southern Force had been annihilated in a classic night battle, their ships caught in a deadly crossfire between our battleships and destroyers. The Pennsylvania, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, and California, most of them raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor and rebuilt for revenge, had crossed the T on the Japanese line and demolished it with devastating gunfire. And far to the north, Admiral Halsey's fast carriers were finishing off the Japanese decoy force. All four of Ozawa's carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Kaidos, and Chiyoda, were either sunk or sinking, taking with them the last experienced naval aviators Japan had left. In 4 days of fighting across hundreds of square miles of ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. They'd lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 12 destroyers, over 30 major warships, and more than 10,000 experienced sailors and naval aviators. Our losses, while painful, were comparatively light. The escort carriers St. Lo, Gambier Bay, and Hull, the destroyers Johnston and Roberts, and about 3,000 American lives. A terrible price, but a small one compared to what we'd accomplished. As I sat on the deck of the rescue ship, wrapped in a blanket and sipping coffee that tasted better than anything I'd ever had, I thought about those kamikaze pilots. They'd been brave, I had to admit that. Flying damaged aircraft through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, pressing their attacks home despite wounds and mechanical failures, accepting certain death for the slim chance of damaging our ships. But courage without wisdom is just another form of waste. Those pilots had died for nothing. Their deaths hadn't changed the outcome of the battle or even significantly delayed our advance toward Japan. They'd simply added their names to the growing list of young men who'd been sacrificed to their leaders' refusal to accept reality. The reality was that Japan had lost the war at Midway in June 1942. Everything since then had been just a slow, grinding confirmation of that fact. The Guadalcanal Campaign, the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines. Each battle had brought American forces closer to the Japanese home islands while steadily destroying Japan's ability to defend them. Leyte Gulf was the final proof. When your Navy has to resort to using aircraft carriers as decoys because you have no pilots left to fly off them, when your battle plans depend on coordination between forces hundreds of miles apart with no reliable communication, when your best hope is that the enemy will make a mistake rather than that you'll achieve actual victory, when all of that is true, you've already lost. But the Japanese leadership couldn't or wouldn't see it. So more young men would die in kamikaze attacks, more cities would burn under B-29 raids, more islands would be turned into killing fields as American forces fought their way toward Tokyo. The battle officially ended on October 26th, when the last Japanese survivors disappeared beyond the horizon. Admiral Toyoda's Operation Shogo had been a complete failure, costing Japan most of its remaining naval strength while accomplishing none of its objectives. Our invasion of Leyte proceeded on schedule. General MacArthur waited ashore at Red Beach, fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines. And in naval bases from Pearl Harbor to Sydney, American admirals began planning the next phase of the Pacific Campaign, the invasion of Japan itself. As for me, I spent the next 2 weeks in a hospital ship, recovering from burns and exhaustion. When they finally released me back to duty, I was assigned to another destroyer, another Oerlikon gun, another position in the endless line of American warships advancing across the Pacific. But I never forgot those few hours off Leyte Gulf, when a handful of American ships faced the entire Japanese Navy and refused to give ground. I never forgot the sight of those kamikazes diving through our defensive fire, their pilots choosing death over surrender. And I never forgot the moment when the most powerful naval force in Japanese history turned away from our little flotilla and retreated toward their homeland. We'd stood our ground when everything said we should run. We'd fought when everything said we should surrender. We'd held the line when the line seemed impossible to hold. And because we held, because we fought, because we refused to give up, the invasion of the Philippines succeeded. The oil supplies that Japan desperately needed remained cut off. The war moved one step closer to its inevitable conclusion. The kamikazes had promised their emperor that death would bring victory. Instead, they'd found something else entirely, an enemy that couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be terrorized, and wouldn't be defeated by any amount of suicidal courage. They'd found Americans who were just as willing to die for their cause, but who were fighting for something that could actually be won. That night, as our task force reformed and headed back toward the invasion beaches, I stood at the rail of the rescue ship and looked out over the dark water. Somewhere beneath those waves lay the wreckage of dozens of ships, American and Japanese alike, and the bodies of thousands of sailors who'd never see home again. The price of victory at Leyte Gulf had been measured in burning aircraft carriers and sinking destroyers, in young men who'd died at their guns and pilots who'd flown their last missions. But the victory itself was undeniable. Japan's last great naval offensive had been shattered against the determination of American sailors who refused to be beaten. The kamikaze's promise of glorious death had been answered with superior firepower, better training, and the unshakable conviction that our cause was just. In the months that followed, as American forces island hopped toward Japan itself, the lessons of Leyte Gulf would be proven again and again. The kamikazes would keep coming, thousands of them, diving their aircraft into our ships with fanatic determination. But we'd be ready for them. We'd learned that courage alone wasn't enough to win wars. We'd learned that no amount of individual heroism could overcome superior strategy, better equipment, and the industrial might of an aroused democracy. We'd learned that the wall of fire we could put up with our anti-aircraft guns was stronger than any amount of suicidal bravery. Most importantly, we'd learned that Americans would not be intimidated by tactics designed to terrorize. When faced with enemies who embraced death, we'd proven that we could embrace victory instead. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was over, but the war continued. More battles lay ahead: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and ultimately the invasion of Japan itself. More young men would die on both sides before the Emperor finally admitted what we'd proven in the waters off the Philippines. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Imperial Japanese Navy lay shattered on the bottom of Leyte Gulf, their dreams of empire sunk alongside their ships. The kamikazes had met our wall of fire and been broken against it. And we sailed on toward victory, one battle at a time, one day at a time, until the last shot was fired and the last ship came home. 3 months later, I stood on the deck of my new destroyer as we approached Iwo Jima. The lessons of Leyte Gulf had been incorporated into new anti-aircraft tactics, new gunnery procedures, new ways of coordinating defensive fire. We were better prepared for the kamikazes now, more efficient at shooting them down. But they kept coming anyway. The young pilots diving their aircraft into our ships weren't fundamentally different from the ones we'd faced off Leyte. They were just as brave, just as determined, just as willing to die for their cause. But bravery and determination weren't enough anymore, if they ever had been. What mattered was industrial capacity, America's ability to build ships faster than Japan could sink them, to train pilots faster than they could shoot them down, to produce ammunition faster than we could fire it. What mattered was strategic vision, our understanding that this was a war of attrition that only one side could win. What mattered was the unshakable conviction that we were fighting for something worth dying for, but more importantly, something worth living for. The kamikazes had died for the Emperor's divine glory and the preservation of a military system that had brought nothing but suffering to the Pacific. We were fighting for the right of free peoples to determine their own destiny, for the principle that might doesn't make right, for the idea that democracy was worth defending even at the cost of terrible sacrifice. In the end, that made all the difference. The wall of fire we'd built over Leyte Gulf, with our Oerlikons and Bofors guns, with our proximity-fused shells and coordinated defensive patterns, had held. The kamikazes had crashed against it like waves against a seawall, achieving nothing but their own destruction. And we'd sailed on toward victory, carrying with us the knowledge that no enemy, no matter how fanatically determined, could break the spirit of Americans fighting for their country and their freedom. The tremor in my hands from the Oerlikon's vibration had never gone away. Even now, decades later, I can feel it sometimes, a reminder of those few hours when everything hung in the balance, when the fate of the Pacific War might have been decided by the courage of a few hundred men manning their guns against impossible odds. We held the line. We paid the price. We earned the victory. and the kamikazes found nothing but oily waves where they'd expected to find glory.